Welcome back to the second half of our Sustainability Forum today. We're going to get started right back in with the third session, which is on policy and human behavior. We've been hearing already today about the importance of the human factor, and I think this session is really going to delve into that idea a bit more. So we're going to start with our keynote speaker, Dr. Greg Nemet, who's an associate professor of public affairs and environmental studies here at UW, and he's going to be talking to us about climate change and public policy.
So I really want to talk about three things in the next 15 minutes or so. I want to talk a bit about what makes climate policy hard. The second, I'll talk about a new challenge that makes climate policy potentially even harder. And then three, just a few reasons why I think despite these challenges, we're actually likely to succeed in addressing this challenge. So first of all, I'll say I'm glad this talk is only 15 minutes because I think the first part of it is not going to be that encouraging, so you won't have to stick around for too long until we get to some words for encouragement. So let me just start by talking about the scale of the challenge that we're talking about. So here's a picture of global average temperatures for the last 1,000 years and the next 100 years, and you can see the range we've had for a while, and then kind of what's at stake in the next 100 years. And there's part of it is under our control, and you can think of things like policy and behavior and what we do with our energy system and other things. And part of it has to do with how the climate system reacts, which we're not sure how that'll turn out. So the point here is that there's a wide range of outcomes for how bad or how not so bad climate change could be. And part of it's under our control, and part of it's not. So that's the first point about the size of the challenge we face. The second part is to think not about temperature, but to back off to look at the things that we actually can control, and in this case, it's emissions. So looking at global emissions, and there's two lines here. The high line is a business as usual case, which it's pretty well agreed upon that if population and economic growth and other things continue as they have, that emissions will double by mid-century and double again by the end of the century. So about a factor of 4 increase. But to get to that lowest line on the slide before, that really 1 or 2 degree temperature change, probably 2 degree temperature change, we need to be on that low line there. And the point there is that we're not talking about a little bit of diversion from the increases that we've been doing. We're talking about peaking in the next decade or two and then rapidly declining and then tapering off at a level that's pretty close to zero in terms of global emissions of CO2 and greenhouse gases by the end of the century. So not a small amount of change that we're talking about, a fundamental transformation of the energy system to get emissions to something that some people think of as safe, which is this 2 degrees temperature target. If you look historically, we've had a general decarbonization of the world energy system by about 30% over the last 150 years. And so that might continue, or it might not. But to get where we need to go, this about 500 parts per million, we need to rapidly accelerate our decarbonization. And if you look historically at what we've done in terms of decarbonizing, here's a histogram of decarbonization rates. And this is every 10-year period over the last 30 years for all the OECD countries and all the BRIC countries as well. And you can see that to get where we need to go, which is something like 6 or 7% decarbonization. So out here, we're mostly in unprecedented areas, but there are some precedents. And I think thinking about where we've actually seen that type of decarbonization is kind of instructive. So the 6 examples we have are 2 parts of the former Soviet Union in the 1990s about modernizing their energy system after the fall of communism there. Second is China in the 1990s, also rapidly industrializing and modernizing their energy system. And then finally in France and Sweden in the 1980s, which is really a shift to nuclear power. So all of those changes that we've seen are historical ones. They're the end of communism, the rise of China, dominating nuclear power where it's 90% of electricity use in France. That's the type of change that we need all over the world for the next 50 or 60 years to get to that type of line we talked about before. So we're not talking about incremental changes, we're talking about historic changes in terms of our energy system. Another aspect of this is to think about what's in the ground, and this is the atmosphere you can see is about 800 gigatons of carbon. to be kind of on par with that 2-degree temperature target or some of the low lines I've shown before, we don't have that much leeway about putting more into the atmosphere, like on the order of a few hundred gigatons, or at 800 now, maybe we could put a few hundred in. See how much we've got left with natural gas and oil. There's a lot more carbon in the ground in fossil fuel reserves. This is how much carbon's in the ground in coal. And so that's going to be a real challenge, is how do we somehow decarbonize our world economy and yet leave almost all of those thousands of gigatons of carbon in coal in the ground, which is a pretty reliable resource, it's a pretty inexpensive resource to extract, and it's a domestic resource for almost all of the large energy economies. So that's part of the challenge as well. I guess another challenge to think about is what goes under this idea of contraction and convergence. So contraction is what I talked about a few minutes ago, that we really need to rapidly reduce our emissions, and that's this kind of total going down. Convergence is this idea that ultimately it's pretty hard to justify in the long term any kind of allocation of rights to emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere other than something that's like per person emission rights, something like that. So if that's going to happen, we are going to have to go from something like 20 or 25 tons of CO2 per person per year down to something like 1 in the next couple of decades. And then finally, I'll just put on the governance challenge, is that this is all not a US problem, it's an international problem. And so we've got this challenge of a truly global public goods problem. There's deep uncertainty about how bad climate change will be, and deep uncertainty about how hard it will be to do something about it. We've got to somehow do this in some level of cooperation among countries of very, very different levels of income and industrialization, with different tolerances for risks, different types of risks, different time preferences, how they value the present versus the future, and doing all of this in a sustained way over many, many decades. So that's the scale of the problem and why this is such a hard and difficult problem, and in a lot of ways an unprecedented one. So if that's not all hard enough, I want to add another problem to this, which is kind of a new problem to layer on top of this. And that's this issue that if you look around in the US today, and this is a pretty accurate representation of the last couple of years, it actually doesn't look as dire as some of these slides that I've just talked about. It actually looks like, on energy, that things are getting much, much better. And they are in a lot of ways. And look at what we've got. We've got energy prices that have come down dramatically in the case of natural gas, but also in the case of oil and also in the case of gasoline as well. So we've got falling prices. We've got an energy security regime that's improved in a bigger way than it has in the last 30 years. We have people talking about energy independence. We're having debates about what we should do with our excess natural gas and even excess oil that we might want to export to other places. Now we're talking about that going the other way, in part because of reduction in demand and in part because of expansion of domestic supply. So this idea that's motivated a lot of effort and policy on energy in the last 40 years seems to be becoming less urgent, not more urgent. If you look at CO2 emissions in the US, those have been going down for the last 5 years. And there's a few reasons for that. In part, it's recession, and in part, it's a switch from coal to natural gas, and maybe there's some other aspects to that as well. But we're not just talking about 1 year, we're talking about a few years, and US is a big emitter, and so this is the biggest reduction around the world in the last 5 years is what's happened in the US. We've got declining emissions. We've even got temperatures that seem like they're stable, not going down, but not rising. So if you look at the last 10 years or so, there's some pretty good fodder for people that don't think that climate change is a real problem. If you look at global average temperatures over the last 10 and even 10 or 15 years, we've got pretty stable temperatures there. It doesn't look like such a rosy picture if you look at the long term. But nonetheless, if you want to be cherry picking, or if you're just concerned about the near term, it does look like temperatures have kind of stabilized. So all of this kind of, maybe I'll reframe my question a little bit, is what do we do if things seem to be getting better, but in the long term, temperatures aren't going to just stabilize for the next 100 years because we've got some pause in the last 10 years. And other issues, whether they're air pollution or energy security, are unlikely to be resolved conclusively and permanently because of what's gone on in the last 5 years or so. And so there's a real challenge here. If you look at what's motivated us to do something on other environmental problems, whether it's the Santa Barbara oil spill or the burning of the Cuyahoga River, or in Europe, Chernobyl or food scares or things like that, we're getting the opposite of that right now. We're getting reassurance that things seem to be getting better. Prices are going down, temperatures are stabilizing, and emissions are going down as well. So I think that's another challenge for doing something about climate policy, is we don't have this sense of a focusing event or some kind of real event that catalyzes some change that we've really relied upon in the past. So something I've kind of advocated is that we might need to take kind of a counter-cyclical approach, similar to the way we do fiscal policy or monetary policy, where we kind of help out the economy when unemployment starts rising or we need to give it a boost. Similarly, with energy policy and climate policy, we probably need to work harder at a time like this when things seem to be getting better and we're not getting a lot of private investment or a lot of effort from other places because the problems seem to be going away and getting better, not becoming worse. So that's kind of one other problem. I just want to finish off with a couple of points, or a few points, about why, despite the size of this problem and the change that's required in this regime right now that seems like it's unlikely to motivate some really big change to actually address the size of this challenge, we do have reasons to be optimistic. So first of all, we've got experience in 40 years of trying things on energy and other environmental policies. We have actually a lot more knowledge now about what works, what doesn't work, where to allocate our dollars, what types of policies to use. And we didn't have that 40 years ago when President Nixon started Project Independence and we tried to reduce our dependence on foreign oil back then. So we've got lessons that we have learned from, we have experience, and that was not always the case in the past. Two, we actually have examples of things that have worked, where we've addressed big problems in a long-term way. And maybe some of the things like counter-cyclical efforts to address monetary policy and fiscal policy, things like Social Security from 80 years ago, and even big environmental problems like ozone, which we addressed in the 1980s, are success stories that we can learn from and maybe take some encouragement from as well. So we do have precedents for doing some of this. We also have models. We have examples from other places, cities around the world, countries around the world, that have accomplished the combination that the whole world needs to accomplish, which is some low energy intensity economy, but high human development. That is, high incomes, high education, high healthcare, high senses of well-being. And we've got examples of that. Japan, Korea, places in Northern and Western Europe as well, where people have found lifestyles that are half as energy intense as ours and potentially moving to even less than that. So we do have places that have accomplished what the whole world needs to do kind of collectively. We have, despite the regime we have in the US right now, where there might not be a lot of incentives to do something about these, about climate policy, other places are doing something about climate policy. And other places are also investing in new energy technologies, not necessarily to address climate policy, but to meet their energy demand. And so places like Brazil and China and India are doing really interesting things right now, and other places are doing interesting things on climate policy. So that's encouraging. It's good that someone else is investing and trying with policy if the US is not doing it in a big way right now. Another area for encouragement and optimism is the kind of general appreciation of how large the scope is for efforts that eventually do something beneficial for climate, but have some co-benefit, some side effect that's near term, that's local, and that might not be that expensive. And so probably the strongest example are things like air pollution policies in the developing world that end up shifting to an energy system that's less carbon intensive as well. So there's really strong encouragement that potentially some places, and maybe even a place like this, we might pursue issues like reducing air pollution and get, as a side effect, climate benefits that come out of it. That the incentives for adaptation to protect ourselves from the change that will happen don't have that same property that mitigation has. The benefits come in the near term. Once you build a seawall, you're protected. And also, they're not dispersed around the world. Once you build that seawall, the people that paid for it get to protect themselves. Now, there are still issues about those who are the very poor or may not be responsible for causing these problems. But in terms of collective action problems, which is really the biggest root of why it's so hard to do something on mitigation, technology is improving, and some of the changes we've seen that have led to this revolution in natural gas could happen and could be improved to have a better and cheaper low-carbon energy systems as well. So that's always something that's moving along, and there's advances in areas outside of energy that are likely to cross over, like information technology and health and biological technology. And then finally, the last point I'll just put up there is it's not always been the case that, that young people have been engaged in some of these energy problems. And I really do see that it is the case now. And I think that's one of the strongest reasons for encouragement is that the people that have the largest stakes in the climate problem, those that are going to live and be around the longest, are getting engaged in these problems, are working on it, are deciding what they might study in undergrad and graduate school, and taking jobs that might have some bearing on some of these problems. And that, to me, is one of the strongest senses of encouragement. Thanks.